Hi friends, welcome to this video. In this video, we are going to see how to simulate a socket programming using multi-threading. Since you know what is meant by socket programming, so socket programming is used to make a communication between two different systems. So communication means we need to send a data and receive a data. So we need to do this by using the multi-threading concept. So multi-threading means in the same process, different threads doing multiple tasks. So here the server wants to send the data and receive the data. So sending will be done by one thread and receiving will be sent by another thread. So here we need to do with server side, and here sending data will be done by one thread, and receiving data will be done by another thread. So in a server itself, we are going to simulate two threads. So one thread is going to do of sending data and another thread is going to do with receiving the data. So since you know, if I want to use with thread, I need to import threading, import thread class, and then to provide a socket programming, I need to use with import socket, and the first step is we need to create one thread for sending, one thread for receiving. So I am going to create a class which is called as sending thread, which is inherited from the thread class. So this class is going to use for sending the data. So as you know, it have an constructor. So init, and then we need to call the base class constructor. So init self. And since every thread class having a run method, so we are going to define a run method. So run method only we define a logic what to do with a particular thread. So run self. Okay, so now I'm not going to write any logic, so I'm going to pass it. So here only I need to write logic for sending data to client. So similarly, we need to create a thread for receiving the data. So receiving the data. So for that also we need to create a class receiving thread, which is inherited from thread class. Again, it have a constructor in it, and invoke the base class constructor. Okay, and then followed by we need to define a logic for receiving data from client, and for that we need to define a run method. We need to define run method. So run method we don't have underscore, so run method, and there we need to write a logic. So since I'm not going to write any logic, so I have passed it. So here also I need to use with run method. There is no underscore, so run method. Okay, so now two threads are ready, one for sending the data, one for receiving the data. So now we need to create a socket to initialize the communication. We need to create a socket, you know, S is equal to socket module. From that we need to create a socket class. So if I'm not providing anything, defaultly it will use the TCP protocol for the socket programming communication. Next we need to bind it, bind the IP and port number. So for that we need to bind it as .bind. So the tuple 127.0.0.1, because I'm going to make my client and server in my same system. So this is the IP for the local host, and then I am giving the port number to initialize the service inside my computer. And the next thing is we need to make it to listen. So s.listen. While listening, it may get a connection request, so it is accepting. So accept the request. So while it accepts, as you know, it will return two outputs. One is the my socket, that is a new socket which is used to send in data and receive a data, and then a socket from the client which is giving a request. Okay, so two sockets are returned while using the accept method. And now we need to initialize the threads. So for send thread, I need to create an object for the sending thread. And then I have a receive thread. And for that, I need to create an object for the receiving thread. Okay, so now we are going to create thread to send data, and this thread create thread to receive data. And now we need to start the thread, then only it will go to the ready state and then it will go to the running state. Then start the threads. So send thread, start it, and then receive thread, okay, receive thread, start thread. So both the threads are started. So as you know, if you want to send a message, you need this socket to send the data. Okay, so this logic I am going to write inside the run method. So the run method needs to know this socket, but this socket variable is available in the main program, but it should be used in this sending class coding. So we need to pass this socket object to this class. So you know how to pass it. So I will pass through the constructor. So I'm going to pass through the constructor. So automatically here the object gets received and we need to initialize it. So self dot my socket is equal to my socket. So now it's initialized. Now we need to write a logic to send the data. Okay, so first I need to get the input from the user. So message is equal to input. I'm getting the input from the user and I want to send it. So self dot my socket dot send. So as you know, in the send method you cannot directly send it, so you need to convert into bytes. The first one is the message, second one is the type of encoding. Okay, so these two information we are sending, and this information to be repeated. Okay, so I'm going to put in a while loop. So this message input should be repeated. So we are going to put the logic so the communication gets repeated. So same thing, if I want to receive the data also, I need the socket object. So what again I have to do? I pass the socket object through the constructor of the class receiving thread, and that it will receive here my socket and it need to be initialized. So self dot my socket is equal to my socket, and now I need to write a logic to receive the data. So since I know my thing is my socket dot receive. Okay, receive. So while it receives, you need to give the buffer size, and now the data will be received in a variable. Since the data will not be displayed as such, you need to convert it. So data dot decode. Okay, we are decoding the message using again UTF-8. this also need to be repeated communication. So you need to put inside the while loop. Okay, so I think now you have go through once again. You have imported the thread class, socket class, because we are going to do the socket programming with multi-threading concept. So within the server side itself, one thread we are going to use for sending the data, one thread we are going to use for receiving the data. So for sending the data, we are creating a thread and we have initialized the constructor, and inside the run method, we write the logic to send the data to the client. And next we are having a receiving data class, and there also you have a constructor and the logic to receive the data from the client. And these steps, first you need to create a socket, bind it, listen it, accept it, and we are creating one thread object to send the data, one thread object to receive the data. Now we are starting the thread so that the thread will go to the ready state and then it will go to the running state. So now we need to write the logic for the client side. Okay. So client side multi-threading. Okay, so same you need to use with from threading import thread followed by import socket. And now we need to create for sending data class. We need to create a thread for sending the data. So class client sending thread, which is inherited from the thread class, and again it have a constructor def init then initialize thread dot init self. Now we need to write the logic for run. So run, we need to write the logic, and now we need to create a thread for receiving the data. So receiving data class, and for that I'm going to create a thread in the client side for receiving data. So this is inherited from thread class, and then init, then initialize the base class in itself, then write the run logic, run self pass. Okay, so now we need to again the same step, we need to create a socket. S is equal to socket dot socket class, and then we need to bind it. So s dot bind pass a tuple 127.0.0.1, and I'm going to use with the IP addresses 3000, and I want to connect to server. So s dot connect, I need to give the IP address of my server followed by the port number, and now the connection is sent, means it has accepted. Now the communication is ready. So now we need to create a thread object for sending the thread and thread object for receiving the thread. So I am going to create C send thread. So for that I am going to create object for the sending thread, and then C receive thread, and for that I am going to create the object for the receiving thread. So now both the threads are in the bond state, we need to start it. So I am going to start the thread by using the start method. Again the receiving thread I start it. Okay. So since the sending thread and the receiving thread need the socket object to send and receive the data, so these two threads we need to pass the object. So S. So as you know here it is initialized here yes, and then here also I am going to initialize it self dot socket is equal to yes, and by using this socket object I am going to send the data to the server. Okay, so here I am going to write the logic to send data to server. Okay, so while sending, first you need to get the input from the user, and by using that you need to use the object, and using the send method, again it needs to be converted into bytes, the message followed by the encoding format. Okay, so now the message is sent. You want to repeat it, so put in the while loop. So now the logic is ready for sending the data to the server. Same thing, you need to receive the data. Receiving also we need the socket object. So pass it to the constructor, initialize in the constructor. So self dot s is equal to yes. And that you are going to use it to write the logic to receive the data from server. Okay, so by using the socket object you need to receive it. So s dot self dot s dot receive. So we are receiving in the buffer, and that will be stored in a variable. This variable you cannot directly print it, so we need to use with data dot decode. The corresponding decoding is UTF-8. While it need to be repeated the communication, so we need to put the while loop. Okay, so now I think you have clear. Now we have imported the thread and socket, created one thread for sending a data in the client side, receiving a data in the client side, and we are writing a logic how to send the data to the server, how to receive the data from the server. And we have created a socket and initialized the communication, and by creating a multi-threading we have started the communication, one thread to receive the data, one thread to send the data. So as you know, every time in order to initialize your client server communication, the server need to be run first. So I am going to run it. So the server is ready now, and now I am going to run my client. Now both my server and client both are ready. So you can start your communication either from the server side or from the client side. Now I am going to start from the server side. So I am going to tell hi from server. So in the client side I got hi from server. So hello from client. So I got a hello message. I am asking how are you server. So my client is telling I am fine server. Sorry, I have given how are you client, but I am fine server. So I got a message I am fine server. So my server is now telling bye client, and here I am getting it. So I am going to tell bye server. So since here the communication is again never ending, so you can put some break condition in order to complete your communication. So from this session you have understand how to initialize the communication between client and server using a socket programming with multi-threading concept. Thank you.